In the past few years, there's been a resurgence for horror movies, but not in the way many would expect. Horror movies have begun to take major influences from classic horror movies of the 70s and flip the modern cliches of the genre on their head. While it seems like Stranger Things brought these influences to mainstream attention and helped fund more of these 70s inspired horror movies, this resurgence has been happening for a few years now, with films like The House of the Devil, The Void, It Follows, and The Witch, among many others, taking influences from the time period, and the recent flood of remakes and reboots of 70s horror movies. It all goes to show that the 70s horror renaissance means a lot to modern filmmakers. So what exactly is drawing filmmakers to draw inspiration from this time period, and what makes it such a great time for this type of horror? I believe it all comes from our tendency to grow fond of nostalgia. You look back at the shows, movies, places, and activities you participated in when you were younger, and you want to go back to those simpler times. If we look at the movies from the 70s and 80s, you could see a nostalgic look at the 50s, with many movies either taking place in the 50s or with 50s vibes sprinkled throughout. With many classics of cinema emerging from all genres during that time period, you can see how these movies affected the youth of that generation. Fast forward 30 years, and now all these young kids are now grown adults, being inspired by classic movies, and they're now either working in the film industry or starting to break into it. So naturally, they would take inspiration from the movies that inspired them as kids, but would end up blending it with the look and feel of the 70s that they grew up in. With many modern filmmakers citing Halloween, The Exorcist, The Evil Dead, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre as influences on their movies, and the similarities between the Italian gore-filled horror movies of the 70s and the modern gore movies, it's not that hard to see that almost every modern filmmaker is taking inspiration in some form or another. So why is this new horror resurgence such a great thing? Well, because horror movies got boring, following the same formulas, using the same predictable jump scares, and the same copy and paste stories. These are still common practices because it allows studios to pump out new horror movies every year, but recently they seem to have faded in the background for the most part. This new resurgence of horror movies is using this all to their advantage though. In order to stand out in the crowd of horror movies, you can see more of a focus on cinematography, editing, and music. Instead of boring, dull-looking scenes, you can now see movies challenging now with interesting, almost art house-like cinematography, popping color palettes, one-shots, and scenes that use camera angle cliches in order to build tension. For example, James Wan's use of the hallway shot that results in nothing. Editing has become more drawn out, and I'm saying that in a good way. Instead of using quick cut after quick cut, scenes are being allowed to breathe and let the tension linger. And most of all, music is becoming a more important element. We have begun to see a large amount of movies using synth beats and orchestral compositions, bringing it back to the old days of John Carpenter's iconic Halloween theme and Ennio Morricone's soundtrack for The Thing. In conclusion, I believe this all comes from the 70s horror movement in some way or another. Directors are showing more influences from the classics of the time and using these to stand out in the crowd of horror movies that get released every year. Horror can be one of the greatest genres when treated with love and care. We saw that in the 70s, into the 80s, and we're seeing it reoccurring now. Let's just hope that it stays around for a while and we can get some more classics to inspire a future generation of filmmakers. If this topic interests you and you would like to hear more about it from a different perspective, I would highly recommend you check out Matt Draper's video, The Return of Kids on Bikes, where he talks about more than just movies but also comic books and pop culture in general.